The cloud. All right, there we go. All right, we're doing it. It's the second take of this workshop. We're figuring out the Zoom issues. It's a sunny day out. It's Wednesday. It's spring. Thank you all for being here. All right. Recording has started. As always, I will send out the link in a follow-up email. We'll make sure that you all have that. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for bearing with us as we navigate the Zoom challenges. It is finally spring. It is crazy to think that it was just a month ago that most of the Cape was out of power and under a couple of feet of snow. That old adage about New England don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes, like really has some truth to it. So thank you all for your flexibility in rescheduling. I'm really excited for today's session. As usual, while I do some introductory remarks, I'd love for you all to put your name, your town, and your board or committee affiliation in the chat so we know who's in the proverbial room today. My name is Amanda Bebrin. I'm the Director of Housing Advocacy at the Community Development Partnership, or the CDP, and the CDP is a nonprofit community development corporation. And we support the Lower and Outer Cape region with things like small business technical assistance, property management of affordable units, first-time homebuyer classes, and housing advocacy through collaboration with municipal business and community partners. We do all of that to have a Lower and Outer Cape that is home to a diverse year-round community of people who can afford to live, work, and thrive here. There's feedback on my microphone. Are you all still hearing feedback on my microphone? No? Okay. Good. If anything changes, please let me know. Okay, so today's session is all about form-based code, and this is the fifth workshop in the 2025-2026 Lower Cape Housing Institute curriculum. The LCHI started in 2017, and it's a program that provides education, resources, and support to municipal officials and staff across the 8 Lower and Outer Cape towns. Its purpose is to help town board and committee members build capacity and expand their knowledge of all things housing so that towns can make progress towards their own stated housing production goals. Planning for, creating, and maintaining housing involves a lot of specialized knowledge, and we're here to help provide that. Our programming is designed for board and committee members and staff for bodies that are involved anyway in housing production, and frankly, anyone who serves in a municipal capacity and is interested in learning more about housing is welcome to attend. The Housing Institute format includes workshops on advanced housing topics like this one. And last year and this year, we've been expanding our lens to include the many things that impact housing and that are impacted by housing. We know that housing doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it's really critical for board and committee members to have an understanding of all the components that make up, the big picture, so we can get to the best possible outcomes for our communities concerning housing and all of our other community goals. We also host quarterly peer groups. We just had spring peer group last week, and those are less formal space for town officials and housing advocates to connect, share ideas and updates, and build relationships across town lines. I'll note that my team also offers technical assistance to help with data and really questions of all sorts. So if you've got an affordable housing or local government question, chances are we can get you an answer or tell you where to find it. Lastly, I want to mention that the Housing Institute is very generously supported by all 8 town community preservation committees and town meeting voters by extension, and we're really grateful for that support to be able to provide the programming and the resources that we do. We are always looking to have more people involved, so please encourage your fellow board and committee members and community members to attend in the future. All right, on to business. I think we've got everybody in the right place now. Again, thank you for your patience as we deal with Zoom. As I mentioned, I do record these sessions, and I will provide the link to this recording along with the slide decks, our contact information for our presenters, and any resources that get discussed. Today's topic is form-based code, and we have really great speakers for today. I'll facilitate some question and answer at the end if we have some time, and feel free to add questions to the chat during the session, and we'll work through as many of them as we have time for. If there's anything we don't get to, please feel free to reach out to our speakers directly. I'm sure they'd be happy to share their expertise with you. So why are we talking about form-based code and design standards? Well, we know that zoning has a direct impact on the extent to which we can create housing and what kinds of housing we can create. And the Cape zoning, generally speaking, painting with a broad brush, allows for the creation of single-family homes on large lots, but it's hard to navigate that zoning to build pretty much anything else by right or by special permit. And as the region considers its housing needs and what strategies can be used for housing production, we're increasingly recognizing that we need a variety of types of housing, and hopefully also to get these homes created faster than the 5 to 10 year timeline that is typical for larger 40B affordable housing projects. There's interest in infill development or directing development to places where infrastructure, services, and amenities already exist. And there's also an interest in having new housing sort of fit in with the current aesthetic of our towns. So instead of our current zoning, which is really based around what we don't want to allow in terms of uses, form-based code is about changing that perspective to think about what we do want to encourage and where and what we want it to look like. A number of towns in the region have already begun making strides in this area. Shout out to Eastham, Provincetown, and Orleans, and hopefully we'll have more towns consider it in the future. So to talk a little bit more about the regional perspective and the housing strategy, I'm going to turn it over to Chloe Schaefer, who is the Chief Planner at the Cape Cod Commission, to tell us a little bit more.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled to be here and good on the screen share. Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, great. Excellent. So I'm just going to set the stage a little bit in terms of housing in the region and our regional housing strategy. The Cape Cod Commission completed this in 2024, and it is the first regional housing strategy for Cape Cod. And its purpose really is to identify strategies and policies to really help address the supply, affordability, and availability challenges facing housing in the region. And it's grounded in 8 different guiding principles. Not going to go through all of them, but these were certainly really critical as we developed the strategy and also perhaps even more critical now as we're implementing it. But they include things like generating a greater variety of housing in terms of the types of housing that's available in the region, making sure we're supporting the year-round population. We know they face specific challenges in terms of housing on the Cape, but also things looking at prioritizing redevelopment, looking at those areas that are already disturbed and that have development already and how we could kind of more efficiently use those to really help address our housing needs. And also making sure that as we're addressing our housing needs, we're also looking to address other challenges facing the region. It's not one at the expense of another, so that we're still protecting our natural and cultural resources and addressing things like climate change and coastal resiliency as well. And so there are several key findings here that really inform the development of the regional housing strategy. One is about 80% of our homes are detached single-family homes, so there's really not a lot of opportunity for different for people who might want a different type of home in the region. Not a lot of diversity there. Housing is very expensive, and we certainly saw prices increase at a much higher rate than actual wages over the last several years. We know there's financial incentives in many cases too to provide a short-term rental. That it takes on average throughout the region about 2 months for income from an average short-term rental to exceed that from an average year-round rental. So certainly some pressure on year-round rentals there. And I'll just touch on that last one in the corner there. About 2% of the region allows more than 2 housing units to be built by right. So certainly not a lot of opportunity throughout the region necessarily in terms of zoning to build other types of housing. And so all of these findings kind of point to 4 key challenges, which is that it's either not allowed or it's too complicated to build different types of housing on the Cape. It's expensive to build new housing. It's expensive to secure housing or maintain it if you already have it. And in particular, it's also very hard to find and keep year-round rental housing. And the regional housing strategy contains 13 regional recommendations. These include things like looking at potentially developing a regional community land trust and housing land bank that could help ease some of the development costs in terms of providing different types of housing. Also looking at things like different financial incentive programs to convert and preserve year-round housing. We've been doing a couple studies both on that and the community land trust in the past couple of years. But that first one here, what we're, I think, more focused on certainly today is looking at changing zoning and also a little bit hand in hand with that is more streamlined permitting for appropriate housing in appropriate locations. So this recommendation of changing zoning, really looking at those different appropriate locations in towns where more housing could be supported, the infrastructure is there, and looking to allow more types of housing, more multifamily housing, duplexes, that type of a thing within those locations, particularly in places where it might be more walkable and there's more opportunity to kind of get around without reliance on a car, and where there is infrastructure as well. And there's certainly many different kind of routes that could be taken in terms of changing zoning to allow for different types of housing. And there are several model bylaws that we've developed as a resource with a consulting team about with Studio as well as Utile. These include things like looking at mixed use, zoning to incentivize year-round housing, as well as things like converting larger single-family homes into multiple housing units. But the one I want to highlight today is this design-driven housing model bylaw. It's kind of we think of it as a form-based code light approach. So it's a little bit less complex than perhaps a full-blown version of form-based code, but really focuses on regulating the impactful design elements in terms of development, with focus on allowing different types of housing and mixed use. And it does provide kind of 5 different sub-districts within that. And I'll go through those very quickly, but kind of at the most dense end, we have our village center moderate density, kind of these places where buildings are really close up against the street, buildings are sharing walls, and often the parking is located to the rear side. And our consultants did these wonderful graphics and test fit scenarios to provide both kind of some visuals in terms of contextually what these areas might be now, as well as then in terms of redeveloping or developing a site within there, what some of the options might be kind of under this potential model bylaw. So there's the moderate density. There's also your village center that's perhaps a little bit less dense. There are spaces between the buildings, and they're set back a little bit farther from the road. We also have the mixed use corridor. So this is kind of more those areas where you might have more of a strip mall retail development pattern, and there are specific parameters for that and considerations. And then also looking at some of the more neighborhood scale areas, so the residential moderate density, smaller lots, and smaller houses in there. And then one also for even lesser density there, and providing, again, different parameters for those sub-districts for towns to consider. This is a model bylaw, so ideally we put it out there as a starting point for towns, but then they can take it and tailor it to suit the needs of their community. And certainly maybe it's not all of these different areas that are within a town. Maybe they would want to focus on just one of these and amending or providing new zoning for one of them according to that. But also just want to throw out there, this builds upon that model bylaw builds upon some multifamily housing design guidelines that we also worked with out within Utile on developing. And so for communities perhaps not ready to take the step in terms of new zoning, there is at least this resource to help provide some guidance in terms of what might be helpful when looking at multifamily development, ranging from all the way from an even accessory dwelling unit or duplex up to those larger corridor buildings to help really provide development in the Cape Cod form and character that we know is really important to preserve as we continue to develop, redevelop, and address our housing challenges. So I will stop there. You can find the model bylaws and many more resources, the design guidelines on our website here, and Amanda also has it, and I'm sure we'll be able to send out those links afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. That's awesome, and a great bit of sort of context and background as we get further into this discussion. And I know one of the sensitivities in communities about going towards form-based code or form-based code light is losing that control that planning and zoning boards currently have in terms of what projects look like. And so having design guidelines and knowing that's a mechanism that communities can take advantage of to have some guardrails. We talk about there are all sorts of guardrails. We won't get into all of them, but there are lots and lots of layers that control, not just what gets built, but how it looks. And so things like this that are, design standards that give communities some reassurance that like, it's not going to be some behemoth. It's not going to be ugly. Like it's going to be in line with what matters to the community. It's going to be a scale that is, that fits in with the existing sort of landscape of things. Like, I think that's really helpful. Thank you for setting that up for us, Chloe, and to give us some more and go deeper into the nuts and bolts of form-based code and form-based code light. I'm going to turn it over to Loren Rapport and Courtney McCracken from Utile Design. And we're
Thank you,
gonna
Amanda.
bring you both
All right,
so that
I'm going to share my screen.
everyone.
Can everybody let me know if they see it okay? Hoping
There
I'm
it
sharing it.
is.
Perfect. Okay, thank you all. So Courtney and I are here to talk to you today about our experience with Utile developing form-based codes. We're super excited to chat with you all. Um, I am a senior urban designer and architect at Utile. I've been here 5 years and have worked on with 3 different municipalities now, 2 of which are here with us today, Watertown and Orleans. So super excited to bring my experiences with form-based codes to chat with you all today. I'm going to pass things to Courtney to introduce herself as well.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Courtney McCracken. I'm an urban designer here at Utile, and I have been at Utile for just over 2 years. And I've worked on multiple form-based codes, most recently in Orleans with Loren, and also in Provincetown, which I'll be taking the reins and presenting about Provincetown today. And I've also worked in a couple other communities like Belmont, Harvard, Air, and Watertown.
Thanks, Courtney. And just for those who might not be familiar with our practice, we're a 90 to 95 person architecture, urban design, and planning studio based in Boston. But we've been to the Cape a number of times and really know the region well. So before I dive in, just a little primer. We're going to start with the basics of situating form-based code against other types of zoning that maybe some of you might be familiar with. And then we're going to go into 2 case studies. So Courtney will follow up with her experience in Provincetown, and then I'll close things off in our presentation with Orleans. So before we get into form-based codes themselves, maybe let's situate things relative to traditional zoning. Many towns on the Cape certainly use traditional zoning that's more concerned with measuring density with floor area ratio. And traditional zoning in this sense, is really designed to keep incompatible uses separate, but isn't so concerned with how buildings look and feel. And it certainly doesn't give priority also to how they interface with the street and the public spaces and private spaces around them. So there's also a bit of inflexibility, let's say, around those missing middle scales of housing that so many towns and municipalities are looking to adopt. um, so if we think about it relative to what I'll call conventional form-based zoning and form-based light zoning, this traditional zoning does have some advantages and disadvantages. The advantage being that it is easier for municipalities to get an accurate gauge of future impacts on key metrics like sanitary sewer, et cetera, because they're able to use FAR to get a clear sense on the projected capacity or build out of what the zoning will provide. However, the disadvantages are you have less control on the direct or less predictability, let's say, for the built outcomes of the zoning, because there's nothing regulating the actual shape or form of the buildings. In conventional form-based zoning, there are is a direct response to that really, and it provides a big rule set that regulates a variety of things that have to do with building form. And the advantages are that you're able to have more predictable built outcomes that are rooted in contextual development and very place-based. However, a disadvantage for this type of form-based zoning is because it's so exhaustive, it really does require that the municipal staff is trained and understands well the form-based zoning itself, but also that they have the capacity to be able to undertake this kind of review and administer the form-based zoning across a variety of projects. And so our approach as a firm is we've developed what we call form-based light zoning. It takes the advantages of conventional form-based zoning and directly addresses what are the things maybe that are too difficult to work out for many municipalities. And so we've distilled this down into a combination of more simpler rule sets. And so it's identifying the design standards that have the most direct outcomes on built form. And they're still very much rooted in a sense of place and derivative of, a long series of community engagement so that they reflect community values. Like form-based zoning, however, it can be a little bit more difficult to generate useful metrics, but I should caution, not impossible. It is, you can still do it. And so flashing up to what Chloe previously shared, we did collaborate with Outwith and with the Cape Cod Commission on these wonderful design guidelines. And so the advantages of a design-based approach are because they're so rooted in place, they reflect community values, they can lead to more cohesive experiences throughout the place. And because there's all of this detail that is, and I would say intention and care that's built into the zoning. And because it's hopefully by right in these communities, what it means is less review time and less expense. So you're able to get development built faster and permitted faster, and hopefully also that reflects what your community wants to see built. And so it's something that we are really excited about to see happening more and more in other municipalities. So part of this kind of what I'll call menu of design standards is identifying a series of different standards, both relative to how things look and feel on a lot. So where the building sits on a lot, the amount of open space on it, whether you allow multiple buildings, to standards that regulate aspects of the building themselves, whether it's story height, the overall building height, dormers, where you're how to articulate your facade, etc., down to site standards. And we think these are increasingly important, which is where you place parking, how much parking to have, how the parking relates to curb cuts, driveways, access issues, etc. These are all things that we think about and are still very much baked into the zoning and form-based light zoning. So as Courtney and I mentioned, our firm has really been developing our approach to form-based light zoning over the years. We've been, our first zoning code was Littleton, which was adopted in 2019. Since then, we've been kind of all over the New England map, so to speak, in Burlington, certainly on the Cape with Orleans and Provincetown, and, in Watertown and Belmont as well. And so Courtney and I are going to speak particularly about Provincetown and Orleans, which are our two most recently adopted zoning codes, and I will pass things off to Courtney.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren. I also saw in the chat that we have a Provincetown resident in the audience today, so hopefully none of this is surprising to you. So just to orient us a little bit to this project, our study area was along Schaefer Road, which is sandwiched between Route 6 and Bradford Street, and kind of serves as this kind of a vehicular thoroughfare between the two streets. And then Commercial Street, which is the really prominent active pedestrian kind of touristy street, is located just south of that and right below Bradford Street. So getting into the why of this project, essentially there was a 75% transportation improvement project that was going to be happening along Schaefer Road, where there was going to be new bike paths implemented and the road was going to be reconstructed. And this is part of the 2025 improvement plan. And as a result of this, Provincetown put out an RFP as a way of rezoning Schaefer Road to have this critical need for housing improvements and options, and thinking about mixed use development along this commercial corridor. So the how of this is looking into the vision plan, where we began this kind of process of looking into the existing conditions and the existing zoning, and then starting to do some test fits and thinking about urban design principles and ways that people could begin to develop and kind of circulate through Schaefer Road, just because the current conditions, especially for pedestrians, are quite not pedestrian friendly in a way, and we'll get into that a little bit later when we kind of show existing conditions with site visit photos that we took. So yeah, we started to go through the study of the existing uses and thinking about the existing zoning, where as Lauren just propped up here, we were looking into the permitted uses and dimensional standards and how these kind of resulted in buildings being pushed back from the main thoroughfare, which we know is a pattern through a lot of existing zoning where parking kind of ends up being prominent in the front and kind of adjacent to the street, and buildings end up in the back and end up being possibly underutilized depending on what kind of use that they have. So incentivizing further development where it can be pushed towards the street with our new zoning. So this is where, again, form-based code comes in as a regulatory framework, as Loren was talking about. Next slide. To support the community vision. So this is just a quick little preview of what our form-based code diagrams ended up looking like. But yeah, really incentivizing development that was appropriate to Provincetown's vernacular scale and existing character of other neighborhoods within Provincetown. So really connecting Schaefer Road, where it kind of had this disconnect, and it was again serving as this more vehicular thoroughfare and less of a neighborhood street that we were wanting it to be. So Provincetown had a very interesting approach to our community outreach that is a bit unique to other projects that we have done at Utile in terms of form-based code outreach. So a couple of things we've done. We had a specific website where people could log on and see the latest news of what we were kind of working on and updates from meetings. We had developed yard signs that had been placed around the city, as well as some posters. The city or the town of Provincetown was able to also post these on their Instagram. And then one of our most exciting and unique aspects to this is Utile's office administrator, JP, is a Boston-based drag queen. So we were able to bring her along with us for one of our community outreach events where she was able to promote to residents and also tourists that were walking along Commercial Street to come to our event. And really engage with us as the event at that time was a little bit further from the downtown kind of commercial street core. So really engaging people to come up to Schaefer Road and participate so we could get some feedback. Additionally, we had, again, these in-person community meetings, an online visual preference survey, and a lot of interactive engagement materials. So getting into a lot of the GIS data that we started to look at, which was some of the first analysis that we did, that ended up shaping where we went with the project. We started with looking at the range of existing uses, and possibly one of the most important things that we noticed from looking just at our study area was the fact that at the north side, this is oriented a different way, but if you're looking on the left, that's where north would be. The north side is that a lot of the parcels were significantly larger commercial parcels, and at the south side, they were a lot smaller, and it tended to be more multifamily or single family, where it started to get closer to Bradford Street or Commercial Street. So this became important when we were thinking about the two different zoning districts that we ended up formulating for the final zoning, which again, I'll get into after. But that was the key that we kind of picked out was kind of creating this division where we would separate those two zoning districts so that the entire site was not zoned under one sized form-based code, and that things could be unique to the existing conditions. And then again, looking at the existing conditions and parcel study, just kind of looking at what the buildings that are currently there are starting to look at. So where you see these two separate colored bubbles, that's kind of where we started to separate these two zoning districts. So this map here just starts to look at the story heights of the different buildings that existed on site. So you're kind of looking at about 2 stories as the maximum. There's a couple outliers that are a little bit taller, but for the most part, that's about the maximum that Provincetown was building at the time. Then thinking about the audio-oriented corridor of Schaefer Road. So these were images we were able to look at these first with Google Street View, which was really great. But we were also able to do a site visit before one of our community workshops, which is really helpful for us as the designers and planners to be able to walk the site on a really warm June summer day to understand how poor the conditions still currently are if they're still doing the development. But for pedestrians where there's no sidewalks, it's mostly just asphalt and parking. There's not a lot of trees. So on a very warm summer day where you might be walking to go and get your groceries at Stop and Shop, it's extremely inaccessible if you don't have a car. So these were just a couple of the sites that we looked at for inspiration, where again, the Stop and Shop, which is the example to the furthest left, has this large commercial parking lot where the building is set back from the street and there's no sidewalk. Another example, which is a local restaurant where parking kind of circles the entirety of the building, but is still placed in front, again with no sidewalk. And then a more recent residential development that has a bit of front-facing, accessible, active use on the ground floor, where the residential developments on this site start to kind of hug the parking in a way where the parking is then hidden specifically from the front lot line, which is where we took a lot of inspiration. And this building in particular was the one that we took a lot of size kind of guidelines for when it came to developing our form-based code. So the next step after this analysis was getting into the test fit scenarios. So what's not shown here is we first tested out what the existing zoning allowed for us to build. And as you can imagine, based on the size regulations, setbacks, and parking, it was not a lot. So what we ended up doing is we developed three separate parcels that were loosely based off of existing parcels. We had a small, a medium, and a large. And after we had gone through and seen what the existing zoning allowed us to build, we kind of came up with a couple frameworks for parking regulations and building height, where we would start to test how new development under new zoning regulations would start to look and start to be laid out on the site. So for the small and the medium site, which are the two at the top, we started to think about the options of having 2.5 stories in the front with ground floor, either retail or commercial, or again, like an active use development, and then having larger up to 4-story buildings in the back, but they were still quite small developments. So the one on the left shows 2.5 stories and the one on the right shows up to 3.5 stories. So thinking about the difference in sizes for those ones. We were also thinking about consolidating curb cuts and again, making sure that the parking was always tucked behind the front buildings. And then for the large site, this site specifically, it was hard for us to disguise what the site was kind of attempting to communicate. So this one was based off of the Stop and Shop. And the thing with that site is that the Stop and Shop is the one major commercial grocery store in Provincetown, and it's along our site. So it's one of those sites that is going to be hard to redevelop if it is ever redeveloped. However, it was one for us that was really interesting to study. So we started to think about like what's existing on the site and if there's a way to infill what's existing with small scale retail and residential uses that start to hug the street and kind of again disguise the parking so that it's not exactly right in your face when you're walking or driving. Another concept, which is possibly the most odd of the concepts we wanted to kind of think about how this would work, would be that there is a 2-story grocery store with retail above, where it is kind of this double-loaded corridor. Again, it was widely received in different manners with the community, and we knew this was what would happen, but we wanted to see how something like this would happen. And then the last option was similar to the small and the medium, where it kind of creates this mixed use village where you have these commercial uses in the front with residential uses in the back, which again is a little bit different than the existing, where it's this large big box retail, and this one is more split up, smaller commercial buildings where it'd be much more of a marketplace condition. And then thinking about the building to street relationship. So as I was saying earlier, the transportation improvement project is starting to introduce new bike lanes and sidewalks. But we realized again what the existing conditions created were these buildings that were significantly still set back from the road because of the parking that was in the front. And it creates this poor relationship from the buildings to the street, and there's not much landscaping going on. So what we made sure from our test fits going forward was that we were reproposing this new building to street relationship where again the buildings are pushed forward. They're still set back from where the lot lines are, like so there's still opportunities for active use spaces and for landscaping in the front, but that there's always parking that is in the back so that it's never creating this relationship where buildings are pushed back significantly. And this logic came from the existing 1-to-4 relationship of Schaefer Road. Next slide. Where the buildings are again significantly set back. However, on Commercial Street, they're at about a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-1.5 ratio, where it starts to kind of create this more pedestrian-friendly relationship, but it also starts to slow traffic down a little bit because of the closeness of the buildings. Cars are automatically wanting to go a little bit slower. However, we understand that for Schaefer Road, it is a little bit of a different type of relationship than what it is to Commercial Street, and we didn't want to necessarily recreate Commercial Street exactly. So we proposed a 1-to-2.5 relationship. Next slide. A 1-to-2.5 relationship, where our buildings are set back a little bit further, yet still creating a really great relationship to the street based on the height of the buildings. So this brings us into our form-based code where, as I was saying earlier, we had 2 separate districts where we had District 1, which allowed for a little bit taller buildings that were more to the north of the site, and then the smaller District 2, where the parcels are a little bit smaller, and it creates a more village scale where it gets closer to Provincetown's city center or town center, if you will. So then looking through what we ended up creating with our street level perspectives, this is the conceptual rendering for District 1 that I was describing. So this, if you look on the right, we're kind of close to where Loren's mouse is right there. So that building is essentially the building that I had talked about at the beginning of our presentation, where we were really inspired by that residential development. So thinking about the relationship of a building of that scale to these new developments that are up to 3.5 stories in the front. And it creates this multifamily housing situation with these active ground floor, retail, restaurant situations where it can also be more of an active use space for the residential buildings as well. Like this could be, a lobby, just as long as it's creating this active use. So, and again, thinking about how you're not seeing parking in this at all. So there's only one curb cut where parking would be at the back. Yep, thank you, Loren. And then there's multiple buildings in a lot. You're not seeing it in this view, but the intent would be that there's these 2 buildings on this lot. However, there'd also be additional buildings at the back if the lot size allows for additional development with the parking numbers that we worked out. This also creates a really nice continuous street wall that activates interest. And then thinking a little bit about facade articulation, which I'll get into in a second, which is one of our most important aspects of the form-based code that we had. And then moving on to District 2. So as I was saying, we had that separation. So the main difference between the 2 is that District 1 was able to go up to 3.5 stories, whereas District 2 at the front was able to go up to 2.5 stories. So just that 1-story difference kind of creates a much more village scale development, where again you have this kind of facade articulation, which we had taken inspiration from contextual buildings, and then in the back where you're kind of seeing the Provincetown monument, the like orange colored building close to where Loren's mouse is, that would be a building that you could also have on the site. So again, you're able to have multiple buildings on a site, and that one, because it's not directly street facing and is located at the back, can go up to 4 stories. And then where you're seeing the parking is kind of sandwiched by the 2 buildings. So our form-based code document, this is just, a quick little look at what this long document ended up looking like, but it's very important to us as designers and planners that we have like a really great graphic approach to these. So it's very legible for people that are not necessarily wanting to, read through a bunch of Word document jargon that can be kind of confusing for a lot of people. So diagrams really help for people to be able to look through and fully understand what we were able to get at. So we were looking again at lot standards, different site standards, building standards, which again, the half-story appearance and facade articulation I'll describe more in a second, and then other provisions where we updated like the use table and we had additional incentives for affordability. So the half-story appearance, what was most important was that you had to have this a specific dormer rule for half-story appearances within the first 60 feet of the building from the front lot line. And we basically had again where it was 3.5 stories for tier one, and then 2.5 stories for tier two. And the dormers that are placed on these half stories had to be less than 50% of the entire length of that facade, so that these dormers were not super long as well. They were placed back from the facade a little bit. And then the facade articulation standards, this is something that we have for each or for most form-based code projects that we do, and Loren will get into this a bit for Orleans, where after a certain length a facade, you have to create a break where it's either an offset or a recess. So again, these were numbers that we had taken from inspiration from existing Provincetown buildings that we felt were great examples of these. So facing the front lot line, you could go 35 feet maximum before you had to have an offset or a recess. And if it was a side lot line or, something that was not facing the lot line at all, you could go up to 50 feet max before you had an offset or a recess. And I believe that's it for Provincetown, and I'll pass it over to Loren to talk about our work in Orleans.
Thank you, Courtney. All right, so some things as I go through this presentation will look hopefully more familiar to you now based on what we've been describing thus far. But essentially, our goals for doing the downtown Orleans zoning update were many. We were looking to create more housing opportunity. We certainly know that the regional housing concern is felt acutely on the Cape. We're looking also at promoting more attainable workforce housing. So that was part of our zoning mandate. We wanted to make sure also that we could have the missing middle scale of housing that is so sorely missing right now. We were also balancing housing production, though, with needs around strengthening existing businesses and allowing for new businesses to come. So looking at how we can encourage more active uses in the downtown. Another thing I'll mention that was an impetus for the zoning is also about creating a more cohesive character and experience for downtown Orleans. Right now, and this is our study area, it's around 1.5 mile long stretch off of Route 6. So it's really following the spine of 6A, which goes down through the downtown of Orleans. We have a variety of different characters, I'll say, of the urban design as it exists in the study area right now. So it's anchored by these large big box developments on either side of the study area. So here's an example of the Shaws there. There's the Village Center located in the center of our study area, and that has more, I'll say, pedestrian-friendly development than other parts of the study area. And then we have, this part of the study area to the north, which is, I'll say, more auto-oriented, parking facing the street, large setbacks and development. So these were all things that we were studying as we were getting into the zoning and thinking about what exactly we needed the new zoning to respond to. These are just a few more examples of the wide range of character that we see within the study area today. Our process was an impressive 1 year long. We were excited to get going in the spring of last year. We really started with understanding the constraints and opportunities of the existing zoning so that we knew what we needed the new zoning to respond to. We were also engaged in a lot of different types of community outreach. So we had an online survey at one point that was really interactive and looked to get input from a variety of folks who might not otherwise show up to meetings. So we had great involvement there. We met with different stakeholders, both residents, business owners, developers, etc. So that we heard a lot of great feedback. We also had an initial community meeting to understand general preferences and what they would like to see as we developed the zoning. And then we came back later in the year and had a couple more community meetings. This is where we were really drafting the zoning itself, getting feedback, refining it, and coming up with the final zoning, which has now been passed. So again, part of what we set out to do was understand the limitations of the existing zoning. And we drew through a variety of different sites. We picked up to 5 that represented a range of conditions in Orleans. And in drawing through what was the maximum development possible under the existing commercial zoning, we were able to understand better what the limitations are that exist today. So we identified 4 limiting factors. One is there's a residential density cap that exists under the zoning. The other is building height, where you're limited to either 30 feet for commercial or residential, or 42 feet for mixed use. Floor area ratio is certainly another factor that's capping the amount of maximum development you can do. And then lastly, just high commercial parking requirements. Parking is usually something that we find that really influences the amount of development you can place on a site. So that was certainly true in this instance. So after analyzing the existing zoning, we were able to come back with a toolkit of 4 primary things that shape building form in this zoning. So one is setting a maximum building footprint, which sets the maximum area per story. Second is having a clear definition around measuring building height in stories and feet. Third is providing standards for how to shape the roof form, so that top level of the building. And lastly, providing options to articulate the facade and encourage variety in buildings. And so in looking at Orleans, we started with this concept of trying to understand what is really shaping the experience of downtown today. We know it's an auto-centric corridor. We created this map that isolated the amount of parking, pavement, and asphalt, really just to drive home how much Orleans is reliant on the car as far as its patterns of development. And in noticing that, we came up with this buffer zone concept where essentially along those key streets that make up downtown Orleans, we want to reinforce a more village scale of development. And so we've set aside this 100-foot wide buffer zone that's really meant to encourage a smaller, more pedestrian village scale of development within this area. And zooming in, oops, I did not have the zoom in, but where I have this bold line is where we were initially thinking we would require ground floor active use in order to get the mixed uses that we know are so desired in this area. So ultimately we ended up with 2 zones. One is that village scale corridor buffer zone that I mentioned, and that's again that 100-foot liner along the key streets of Orleans. This is where we're going to have smaller, more village scale oriented development. So we've got a primary building that can go to a 4,000 square foot footprint, and then you can have secondary buildings on the lot that are smaller, 2,000 square feet. And these are going to be 2.5 stories tall in keeping with the existing context. And then behind that zone, in areas that are, less sensitive or less, because they're not street facing, we have the commercial center zone, which allows for larger building footprints and up to 3.5 stories in height. So here's just an example of how that plays out with the village scale corridor facing the street and the commercial center zone behind it, where you can see that we allow smaller footprints up front and larger footprints in the back. Our building height is, again, regulating the full height, but we're changing the definition so that it goes to the top of the pitched roof, to the top of the roof beam. We think this is a more kind of intuitive way of measuring building height. We were also setting standards around the minimum ground story height, and this was to ensure that we're getting the types of active uses we want to see where we're requiring them. We also have standards around the roof form. We heard early on, at first we were starting with optionality of having a pitched roof and or flat roof, half story, and we heard pretty well early on that pitched roofs were what was desirable for this area. And so this is essentially an envelope for the maximum roof that you can build. So we're setting standards around the slope, the height for this knee wall. This is really to encourage that this is an occupiable level, as well as dormer requirements, which might look familiar to you from what Courtney shared in Provincetown. We also had standards around facade articulation, and we wanted to make sure, again, we were looking at existing context and what seemed to fit well with existing patterns, and what was considered desirable from what we heard from the community for Orleans. And so we have different standards for the maximum facade length when you're facing a street or front lot line, and we have larger continuous facade length standards for facades that face any other lot line. So in developing these standards, we, similar to Provincetown, went through a series of test fits. So this is the existing condition today of one of our larger sites that has a large parking lot facing the front lot line and a large commercial development in the back. We looked at what the existing zoning test fit resulted in, which, because of the high commercial parking requirements, you're not able to get a lot of development on the site, and you're also not able to get a lot of housing on the site with residential density limits. And so this was, as we were developing the zoning, some of our initial pass at what the zoning could yield. So we still have, this is that 100-foot buffer line concept. So all of these buildings are conforming to early ideas of that village center zone. So there's certainly smaller footprints. And you can see how the buildings in the back are larger in footprint and scale. So it was helpful for us to draw through these test fits, walk through these initial standards with the community, and then shape them into the final zoning today, which the zoning that got passed, now these are 2.5 stories in height in the village center zone. And we've also kind of done some additional thinking around how to incentivize attainable and workforce housing. There are additional standards, and I know we're almost at time, so I'll just rush through them. The zoning supports active ground floor uses with standards around their maximum facade length and depth for those uses. We also have frontage types that are built into the zoning. This is really to encourage more intentional design thinking around how buildings engage the space around them and the front lot line. And we have a variety of different building components that we've developed standards for. And these are really, I'll call them bonuses. They don't count toward the building footprint, but they're meant to encourage variety so that you don't end up with cookie cutter development throughout the area. And then lastly, we have standards around parking placement, where it's allowed, how it's accessed, et cetera. But again, encouraging parking to be placed behind buildings and not to be so front and center in new development. So just, I'll end with these images, which show, I think, really proof of concept for the Orleans zoning. This is the existing condition today with parking in the front. And you can see how with the new development, we're really engaging the street more. We're creating a more active ground floor with mixed uses and these intentionally designed frontage zones that are meant to be more pedestrian friendly and active. So I'll end with a few takeaways before I pass things back. We've learned a few lessons now from our experience on form-based codes. Understanding what your goals are certainly first is a great place to start. Is it housing production? Are you trying to control development size, or is it both? We think that it's really important to keep the code simple so that your audience and those that are administering it can understand it and enforce it. And then, understanding the building code impacts is certainly important. As architects, that's something that we're thinking about, and that's what's built into the zoning itself. And then really just stress testing. We work very iteratively, so understanding how these play out on different sites and communicating what is possible with the existing zoning versus the proposed zoning, we think is huge in really maximizing the impact and how others can understand it. So thank you.
Thank you, Loren and Courtney, so much. It has been so cool to see what Orleans and Provincetown have been working on. And thank you for rolling it all up at the end so I don't have to, on the fly, try to write a bunch of takeaways. But it's going to be really interesting to continue to see how the changes translate into actual projects. But I love that, this is still grounded in community engagement and really grounded in the locality, and it can be tailored to what communities are looking for. So there's still that sense of control over what our communities look like, but sort of front loading it so that it's easier on town hall staff and administering it, and for applicants themselves to be able to bring projects forward. So we're going to wrap up today. I'm going to turn it over to Gideon Schreiber, who's the Director of Planning and Zoning from the City of Watertown. And he's going to talk about some projects that Watertown has been able to see work through the process, through their own process of form-based code light and zoning changes. So Gideon, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for having me. Gideon Schreiber, Director of Planning and Zoning for the City of Watertown. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully this works. Can you all see it?
There it is.
Yeah,
That's good, Gideon.
Took a little while there. Some of my slides might be a little bit repetitive, but I'm going to skip over those pretty quickly to get into the bones. But I wanted to make sure people knew where Watertown is in context, because it's obviously not the Outer Cape. And I don't know if you can see my screen, but Boston's here, and Watertown is actually touching Boston along the Charles River. And it's directly west of Cambridge as well. Belmont's to the north, Newton is to the south, and Waltham is to the west. From a context perspective, Watertown was slowly shrinking. It had a lot of density, but it was starting to get smaller. So you can see our population has started to change, and it's because of a lot of larger scale developments. Watertown, unlike a lot of the parts of the Cape, has a pretty substantial number of residential density. You can see one unit is in blue. We have just over 4,000, 5,000 units of single family, mostly two family, and then a bunch of a mix of multifamily today. We're about a 50% renter owner community as well. Watertown's been zoning, it turns out, for 10 years longer than what I thought in our original bylaw, which is now ordinance. Watertown's a city. We used to be known as a town, but we were actually a city since 1981. So we actually have zoning that goes back to, they were experimenting with it, and that first experimentation back in the day sort of is like a very, very, very form-based light zoning. They had a 100-foot buffer along Mount Auburn Street. Over time, there has not been a lot of change. This map and the map behind it, this map, 100 years of zoning where we said, here's industry, here's business, here's the rest. But back then, the use wasn't as important. Then they started to differentiate, separate it. And here's our current zoning map, which Loren and Utile worked a lot on with us as we went through the process for MBTA communities. So I don't want to go into all this zoning recap, but I did want to kind of show context that Watertown's been around a long time. It's very dense. It has a lot of stuff going on. It's had a long history of zoning and a long history of being built out. It's completely built out. It's one of the densest communities in the state, even though it's not on that list. It's, I think, 7th or 8th, depending on how you divide it. So it's a much different context than portions of the Cape. Starting in the 2000s, we started looking at kind of conceptual ideas of form-based light. Unfortunately, sometimes graphics were a barrier to new modern day zoning. It's limited back then as far as how you would just put it in zoning. So that was a ironic buffer. So we took an industrial zone and created a new zone, the Pleasant Street corridor, and we started to see change there. Those gave us examples. We created build-to lines, creating a street form, etc. We then created a mini moratorium to create design standards and guidelines, again, but not form-based at all, but really leading towards it, but with more flexibility and no by right areas. Then we started really focusing on the housing pressure and economic development, and then ultimately looking at Watertown Square, which was a mixed use, 50 feet, FAR 4.0 period. You could build a building anywhere on a lot. up to 4 stories, and look at that area for the MBTA communities, but also just to like relook at it since its first creation back in the early to mid 20s. So this was a kind of an example of our first design guidelines, which also included standards back in 2015 for larger scale development. And it really started to help, set the stage and help the boards and also the community understand where we're going. We created a single handout poster as well as a guidebook that we could give to development community, members or the development industry. And it also is much more, to guideline thinking about public realms, sustainable design, parking access, building setbacks, building height, building massing, material selection, and even signage, but that one's definitely the hardest one to deal with. So it's a guideline, so it's flexible, but there was very specific standards. And then the work that we did in Watertown Square with Utile was, built on this set of guidelines, and those didn't go away. So they're still across most of our commercial corridor. We had a process, and it works pretty well in Watertown. Watertown has a planning board and a zoning board. The planning board is a permit granting authority for some projects and not for others, depending on the zone. Neither of them are elected. They're both appointed. So we are professional heavy. At one point, the zoning board had not one, not two, 3 land use attorneys, like professional land use attorneys working in Boston, in the region. There's been periods where right now we have 3 architects, an engineer, and a planner on our planning board. So it's 5 members, and they're all professionals within the industry, and they're all residents of Watertown. So we have this series of boards, and we have a design review. So that's what we had then. Thinking about our new zoning, we wanted to look at options, and we also had to look at the MBTA. So we created this transit-oriented development overlay, which is a by right area. And then we also created these new zones, which have a planning board review and a zoning board approval still, which is, we didn't take it away, didn't create that controversy. And so long ago, we created this kind of guide where you have to do a community meeting and a developers conference and design review, and then perhaps, depending on the scale, another community meeting before you submit a formal application. You have a formal application, a staff review, staff report, board meetings, decision, and then you get to go wait for the appeal period, and then you can go pull the building permits. The new zoning in the by right area takes away one of the board reviews, but we still have community meeting requirements. We still have a developers conference so that the community and the departments can look at it to ensure that all the utilities and all the different pieces are dealt with. I saw in the chat someone asking about light. We have a light requirement in our zoning. All of those pieces still need to comply with other aspects in our by right zone. The big change was that it's now in the Toto, the to-do, I played with that a little bit. It allows the process to go to the planning board, a single board review and approval. And it's not a 40A approval, it's a site plan review. So it's by right, but with conditions that are reasonable. And it means that there's not a appeal period. The neighbors can't appeal it immediately. They have to wait. It's appealable only at the building permit phase. So it creates more predictability, and it does, even in a streamlined process like we already had, it does change things. I'll get into it more when we get into the 2 cases that I have here. I was asked why change. It's a tough one. We were getting some really good projects. We were getting a mix of projects. Watertown is, you just never know when you're going to get development because it's all new or redevelopment. So we had pretty good zoning bones. We had some developments that were working, but it was always based on the board deciding, like, should we lop a story off? That's not a good or predictable model. And with the new area in the zone, it makes it more clear that you shouldn't lop a story off in this area. We had a some things that had been added over time to try to protect certain things, but there was unintended consequences, like a 45-degree step back from every rear property line, which, there's just little things that like started to add up to make it not developable. And then we also had zones that created nonconformities that made it so you could never consider change. So now we have more predictability, and at least half of the site are by right options, but still substantial control by the board to ensure that we're looking at, where the trash is and where the utilities are going and how the lights, et cetera, on the site and how it's interacting with the surrounding built environment that's already there. There was some areas where we increased height and some areas where we took a little bit away. We more defined what the front setback was, and we had clear transitions. This is form-based light. So Loren might actually recognize part of this slide because I took it from a presentation that we had to the city council. These were actually buildings that were under construction or approved or had been built in our previous zoning. So you can see you'll see as we go forward, we've been getting a little bit more of that modern look with these two buildings. They had pullbacks. This one had design guideline. Actually, it was created after the guidelines. This one here was an old brick and concrete yard. It was, and then this piece here was a industrial rental site, and it's now condos. It's pulled back from the street. It turned out our old zoning actually allowed through special permit to not have commercial on the first floor because it was in a commercial zone. So it made it viable when it wouldn't have been before. This one here, there was push and pull, and they ended up creating a step back from the street. And that's under construction right now. And this one is actually complete and fully occupied. And that you can see that 45-degree angle from the rear period. And so it created a stepped building on the rear. So those are some of the things that were happening. People certainly weren't, some people liked it, some people didn't, but that's not what we were looking at. You recognize some of these graphics. In Watertown, we did look at this tiered look in the form-based zoning, but it's also a very built-out environment. So we looked at and changed it from the 5.5, or it's a full story, but it's not. You take away, you subtract parts. So we called it 5+, and we have an old definition of half story, which was really 50% of the floor area period, and so we couldn't have a half story. So there's that. Building placement, we were looking at trying to create a lively place and a place where people would come and convene. You recognize this graphic or something like it. We also looked at zoning to ensure that we didn't lose our requirements for, unlike other places, we actually have a solar energy assessment and installation requirement for certain types of development. We were the first in the state to do that. So we didn't want to lose that by making things by right. So we carried it into a new section and have standards and guidelines related to other aspects. To speak to like what Loren mentioned with parking, and this is probably extreme in a lot of instances, but we removed the parking requirement for commercial and reduced the parking requirement for residential to 0.5 spaces. The economic development studies as part of the project for Watertown Square area plan suggested that probably no developer would be interested in less than, say, 0.7 or 0.8. I feel Loren might recall as well, but I'll show you. You'll be surprised to see that people are actually moving forward with projects with less parking than that. So it wasn't to the full level of like removing parking in its entirety. We are still looking at ground floor retail parking and how we address that longer term with public and shared parking spaces. So I'm going to jump into one of our projects, which is in the heart of Watertown Square. It's not quite a triangle, but it's a very awkward site. I don't know what shape that would be. It's not a parallelogram. There's a triangle. This used to be a rail corridor, so that piece right there is owned by the city. It's been sitting vacant since the property next door accidentally broke the foundation. And so it's been an eyesore in the heart of Watertown Square I've been here for 15 years and it's been empty that entire time. We've had multiple projects try and fail to make something work there because of those very defined the unit and parking requirements. So the goal of and what is making things happen now are this is also in the by right zone. So they had a very clear path. They were considering a one-story commercial building because they bought it. The new developer bought it, and they wanted their office there. So they did hold out, and now they've moved forward with and have received approval for a new project. It has active street frontage, and in Watertown, that was 40 feet of depth of commercial. They're looking at a 40 residential unit project. We have 15% affordable requirements, so there's going to be 6 affordable units, and there's 20 parking spaces. And this is what broke this property for Watertown in the past. That is only a 0.5 per unit with no parking required for the commercial. Every project before that has tried and failed. I mean, they literally like put stuff in the ground and couldn't make it work halfway through. Has failed because of that parking ratio, but also the commercial piece. So this is the site today. It's very blighted. There's this funny looking building next to it that was supposed to have a building next to it, but it's been very visible from everywhere. And it's the back, working side of it. What's been fun about this and also a little bit of a challenge is, and we were very lucky to get a great architect who really could understand, form-based light doesn't have as many graphics always as maybe heavier form. And so we needed to do a little bit more interpretation, but as as you go through a zoning process, you figure out some of the things that you'll have to go back and change. So they looked at this layout and they test fit the building and they ended up with one design that had a sloped roof that really wasn't working. And then this is their final layout. And they kind of show in essence the requirements that are in our form-based code light. One thing that we oftentimes struggle with is where to put the electrical box and the transformers. I'm really hoping that Eversource is going to make this work and it's not going to be sitting right in front of this door over here, but it looks like it would. Just wanted to give you context for like the interior layout of what happens and what implications are for half stories or plus stories or the unintended consequences sometimes. So they're proposing and creating a public space on the corner, which is the former railroad corridor. They're squeezing in the same number of parking spaces as before, 20 spaces. We've made a determination that driveways can be less than 20 feet wide for certain scales, but they do have the opening there. They have commercial and it just barely hit that 40 feet. Phew. That was a tough one. And this is a specific area. And then here's like a common floor print. So you can see this is very unusual and form-based code maybe is harder to make work the more unusual your site is. They don't want to build a design like this with a very complicated hallway. And then they also have your double stairs. But then the top floor, because of the setback, that's all they could. Well, I think they could have fit 2 more, but then they would have had an issue with parking, but they didn't want it. But so they could only fit 4 units on the top floor because of the way the step backs and setbacks are. And then the stairs, the way they designed them are right at the property line, which is another thing we'll talk about, which is party walls in the future versus the current. So here's the design. I don't know how much it comes across on your screens, but this is like our most activated Mount Auburn Street, one of our historic streets. It's had one side with commercial. This side has been a big blank spot, which has been just sitting there vacant. We have a gateway multi-use path adjacent to this. And so this is the design they came to. They framed in a potential future to show that that party wall isn't necessarily always going to be that way. And the board has, encouraged them to consider a reference I hadn't heard of, like ghost signs or some other type of thing, mural, to try to create some kind of activation on this big blank wall that you can't have windows on because it's a party wall. So this is the building from different angles. This is the front as well as this. This is the break between the two facades. It's because it's a triangular shaped front, it could easily convey itself as the same facade on flat paper, but it's really very substantial angles. So that's 33 Mount Auburn. They submitted 1 week or 1 month after the next project, who also had the same architect and team. Am I talking too long? So 108 Water Street has the same situation, slightly different zone, but it's not by right. So it had to go through 2 boards, 2 processes, and it took them, they submitted a month earlier and they got approved a month and a half later than the other project, but with the same level of ability to make change and make it better by the board. But it was a 2-board process still. They again are proposing about the same amount, 52. It's bigger because it's a bigger lot. This one's truly a triangle, and it's also got a 30-foot grade change from the top to the bottom. So form-based code and unusual shaped lots and big grade changes can be a little tricky when trying to create activation, and it's also on an ancient way. So we have small amount of open space. They had to come up with a complicated method to figure out how to measure and what the first floor, ground floor is when one side is sticking out of the ground a lot and the other one's dug into it. Complex, again, an interesting, unusual layout for hallways. They really came up with an interesting way to break the facade up, but also design it because it actually looks down towards the river. So we have a building on the river side and currently this is a parking lot with a office building. So we have elevations and renderings. The board was particularly worried about this first level, which is actually garage. They tucked in a floor of units below the main floor. It's a pretty, interesting look. Nice details, nice materials, solar on the roof, 2 areas of parking, and they're creating a sidewalk where there's currently just a very small road. And then these aren't ones I was going to go into, but I wanted to make sure you could see some of the other things that people have been testing or did. 75 Spring Street is our other lower level zone adjacent to a classic row house development. This is a 3+ story and was 5 units. They had a big party wall on one side. It's probably not moving forward, even though it got approved because the neighbor bought it. So he can now do a combined version of this, which is probably a better outcome. There's some very tight constraints. But I wanted to show you that there's other stuff going on. And then we have some like unique situations or things that are also happening where we have an old Dunkin' Donuts site. So it's big, vacant area, and they're test fitting and they're in the process. So this has been shared with the community. This is a historic district existing house, and this is a parking lot because it'd been turned into an office. And so they're trying to fit in 8 units altogether, converting it back to a house from its current office use, right in Watertown Square as well. And then this one right now, all they have is like kind of the test fit of how, and these were all in zones where you couldn't necessarily do anything because of the setbacks and oddities of stuff. So we have people looking seriously at projects outside of the ones that have been approved. Those 2 were approved, one by right, but with a lot of the same standards. Some lessons learned for me, and more than one building on a lot can be difficult on small lots. Unusual partial shape sizes and access. It always depends in Watertown. We have lots of unusual shaped lots, so it makes it less than predictable. Uniformity of even lots, topography. It turns out we're way more hilly than you realize. Little lots, small lots, medium, all that. Every site has something unique, and so that's hard with certain if you have too much restriction in your form, luckily ours have been pretty flexible to allow us to be that way. And then, the list goes on. So that's, my piece in a nutshell. I think it's been positive because we've seen a lot of, interest, just by looking at the zoning and looking at our priorities of creating active, spaces that we want to go to, and create a more vibrant Watertown Square instead of a very car-centric, center, which has been there since the 1630s. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon. That was awesome. I always like to do some, spotlighting of things that happen over the bridge, which isn't to say that like it can be adapted one-to-one, but as we're exploring housing strategy, it is always nice to know what other places are making good use of, because we can similarly get outcomes that work for our communities. And like, if we don't have to reinvent the wheel, then like all the better. I love, getting concrete about what the goals are. I love this piece of like remembering that buildings don't exist all by themselves, that they're for people to use, they're for our community to use, and how do those interactions with pedestrians, with the road, like how do all those interactions happen, that I think some of our current zoning like doesn't take into account for. I think the Cape has its share of sort of like strange spots or little pockets as well. So it's interesting to see how form-based code light sort of interacts with all of that. So thank you for sharing a couple of case studies and giving us some context about how Watertown came at it. Thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their insight. I think our questions got answered in the chat, specifically around using form-based code in historic districts and how that can sort of be taken into consideration. I will, as I said, put out our speakers' contact information in our follow-up email. So if there are any conversations, some of these look very interesting. So if you have any follow-up questions, please let them know. We've also got, town staff on the call here who I think would also be happy to answer some town specific questions as well. Other things as we wrap up, it's 1:27. If you have ideas for future sessions, if this makes you think of other things you'd like us to talk about that are related, you want to go even deeper, you want to go broader, please let me know. I mentioned at Spring Peer Group that we are coming up on the 10-year anniversary of the Lower Cape Housing Institute, which is crazy and exciting at the same time. And so my team is going to spend the summer thinking about what we might change up for the 10-year anniversary. And I would love to hear from all of you about, what you find valuable about this programming so we can hold on to those sorts of things. But are there changes in format? Are there changes in timing or, topics or whatever it is? How can we make this as fun and sexy as possible, so that you all keep getting the sort of housing education and wraparound education that you need to be able to make good decisions for our region in terms of housing. I will plug that in April, we have our final workshop for the Housing Institute curriculum year. That is going to be about small business exit planning. We'll have our Director of Business and Credit, Pam Anderson, come back to talk about her experience with that and sort of how that overlap between our local economy, business owners as they're thinking about retirement and moving on, and how that intersects with our housing conversation, and how we can sort of be prepared in terms of strategy and policy for those sorts of considerations. I will have this recording and slide decks and everything out to you. Today's Wednesday, by the end of the week. I'm looking at the chat. I don't see anything on fire, which is great. Thank you all again for being here. Thank you all for bearing with us as we navigated some fun technological challenges. Never a dull moment. And I will set you all free to enjoy a lovely spring Wednesday. Thank you so much. Thank you again to our speakers, to Gideon, to Chloe, to Loren and Courtney, and to all of my board and committee members, and staff members and community members. Thank you for all of the work you do and for being interested in learning more about what we can do to work on our housing challenges, and lots more to come. So thank you all. I'm going to push stop on the recording.